Good afternoon. I'm really delighted to welcome you all, a truly international audience, to the second of our two sessions of our Masterpiece Symposium, Journeys Through the Material World. Those who attended yesterday, please forgive my repetition, but we do have a new group joining us this afternoon. The symposium also serves to launch our 2021 online programme, Encountering Beauty Through the Material World. This journey of discovery will encompass monthly panel discussions, each looking at one of 5 different materials and accompanied by a stimulating series of podcasts and short videos. Leading curators from our museum partners will also choose and talk to us about favourite works of art in their collections. And you will find the full schedule from next Monday the 8th on masterpiecefair.com. Our wish, with all of our educational programmes at Masterpiece, is to stimulate curiosity in works of art across a broad spectrum of visitors as part of our overall goal to open the eyes of our visitors to the physical fair, to a world that for some may be not so familiar, as well as encouraging those already immersed in this wonderful world to look at works of art in a new way. For us, it is also very much about taking down the barriers of approachability. I have always found that looking at works of art, both through materials and understanding how something is made, to be a captivating way to engage with and discover works of art to which one may have given less thought. Where has the material come from? Is it easy or difficult to work with, precious or commonplace? All these questions and thoughts open avenues to a new world of beauty. I'm not going to take up any further time, but I'd like to take the opportunity to send a sincere thank you to all of our deeply knowledgeable speakers, as well as to Tom Marks, who will chair today's proceedings and introduce our speakers. I'm looking forward to what I know will be an enormously interesting conversation, following on from yesterday's thought-provoking and fascinating discussion. I do urge you also to stay for the breakout rooms, which provide an opportunity for a really close-up exchange of ideas. Welcome to Materials in the Museum. Tom.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo, and I'm delighted to be chairing this Masterpiece Symposium focused on materiality, materials on the move, and materials in the museum. Yesterday, those of you who were with us talked about how materials accumulate stories or histories, meanings as they move between places or as time passes. Today, we're thinking about materials that in some senses are fixed in their places, at least are fixed in museum collections on the whole. And we're thinking about the history of displaying materials, collecting materials, communicating materials in museum contexts. We're thinking about how well that has been done in the past and how we can learn from the past, but also thinking about what new methods for thinking through materiality might be possible for museums in the future. I'll just give you a sense of how it's going to work today. We are going to have a panel discussion with our 4 eminent speakers, who I'll introduce in a second. There's a chance to ask questions of the panel. I'd ask you, as Nathan indicated, to use the chat box to ask questions. By all means, add them during the panel discussion, but I'll be turning to any questions that are there with about 10 minutes left of the panel discussion. After that, we're going to move into breakout rooms for about 25 minutes. I'll explain a bit more about what we can do in the breakout sessions when we get closer to that. But the real aim here is to allow everybody who's on this Zoom meeting to be able to have a chance to participate in the conversation that we're having today. Let me introduce our 4 speakers. We have Dr. Christopher Maxwell, Kit Maxwell, who is curator of early modern glass at the Corning Museum of Glass in New York. He is the curator of an exhibition postponed, but happening this year, I hope, Kit, is that right? In Sparkling Company, Glass and the Cost of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s. Dr. Caroline Mccaffrey Howarth is an art historian specializing in European decorative arts, material culture, and histories of collecting. And she's the curator of 17th and 18th century ceramics and glass at the V&A. Dr. Dora Thornton is the curator of the Goldsmith Company collection in London. And I know that she has been working on post-war brooches at the moment, because I know she's written an article about it for the future issue of Apollo coming out next month. Before joining the Goldsmith Company, Dora was curator of Renaissance Europe at the British Museum, where her many accomplishments, including curating the new gallery for the Waddesdon bequest. Dr. Charlotte Vignon is director of the French National Museum of Ceramics at Sèvres, just outside Paris, the Musée National de Céramique de Sèvres. And she joined the museum, Charlotte, is right in saying last year you became director, and was previously for more than a decade the curator of decorative arts at the Frick Collection in New York, curating many exhibitions, including working on the Great Goutier exhibition. But I remember your work on Cervantes, because you wrote about that for us. What I've asked all our speakers to do is to provide just a couple of images each, so that we can get in the mood for thinking about materials in the museum. We've all been mostly away from museums, even some of the people who are curating in them for a while. And I thought some images will get us back into the place and into the mental space. So I'm going to ask Nathan to cue up the images, please. And we're going to start off with you, Kit. Could you just tell us what you're showing us here and how it bear on the discussion that we're going to have?
Yes, thanks, Tom. Well, Corning is located in Western New York, and we have about 500,000 visitors a year, or we did have, of course, pre-lockdown, which outside Manhattan and Niagara Falls makes us the most visited attraction in the state. And one of the most consistent comments we get from our visitors, either by TripAdvisor or on-site surveys, is that they never expected this. Most people have preconceptions, I might even say prejudices, about what glass is, maybe clear tableware or lighting, things they associate with their grandparents. Don't want to gender it. But glass can be so much more. And when they get to campus, they can not only see glass being made, but they can make their own glass. They can visit the research library, go through special collections, and see that glass objects themselves are incredibly diverse, from architectural to miniature, ancient, contemporary, scientific, cultural, and so on and so on. And on the screen, I just have a selection of objects that are from our collection that are being displayed in the forthcoming exhibition that you mentioned, in Sparkling Company, Glass and the Costs of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s. And many of them, I think, will be quite surprising to visitors who may be expecting an exhibition about dining and drinking, which is the more typical association of glass in this period. But we have costume, we have a portrait medallion of the abolitionist William Wilberforce. We have a Chinese reverse painted glass depicting European factories in Canton, microscope scientific glass, of course, beads that were used in trade with Africa and the Americas, jewelry for both men and women, and also this extraordinary virtual reality reconstruction of a glass paneled drawing room that was designed by Robert Adam for Northumberland House in London. Anyone who's familiar with the collections at the V&A and the British galleries will know that there are the remaining panels of this room, which is now sadly destroyed, but the remaining panels are in the collection of the V&A. And we'll be borrowing some of these panels from storage along with Robert Adams' designs and combining it with a virtual reality reconstruction. And if I could flip to the next slide, please. Another example of how at Corning we are trying to think around the subject of glass in less conventional ways. The publication that accompanies this exhibition contains 8 essays from 8 different specialists in various fields of 18th century studies, only 3 of whom, myself included, have any kind of formal background in glass. And so getting kind of intellectual elaboration around the subject of glass is something that I'm finding particularly fruitful. In the curatorial staff, we have also varied backgrounds in archaeology, glassmaking, art history, and history, which is, provides a vibrant dynamic, but engaging other people, other specialist fields, and asking people to look at their own specialism through a glass lens is something that I'm finding very exciting at the moment.
Thanks very much, Kit. It won't have escaped our savvy audience that we have two members of the panel this evening who are curators at museums specifically dedicated to one material. I suppose possibly we could say three if we include goldsmiths as well. But what I think is really interesting here is what you're suggesting in terms of how a museum dedicated to a single material is not necessarily a way of hoarding everything that has been made in that material, but somehow a way of thinking about everything that might be possible with it. So I like the way you use the metaphor of looking through the lens, because of course you're offering all sorts of refractions on what is possible with this material. We'll definitely come back to the single material museum or institution later in the discussion. Let's move on, please, to Caroline's slides next.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's really great to be here. So I was actually recently appointed as curator of ceramics and glass for the 17th and 18th centuries at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London during the lockdown. So actually this access to materials without being able to physically go into the museum and into the galleries as much as I'd kind of hoped in the beginning stages of this job is something that I think is really interesting, and we might touch a bit more on kind of digital reconstruction and technology that might help us with this virtual world and how we access materials through that. But for my object today, I wanted to pick one piece from a very vast V&A collection of ceramics to get the ball rolling. So this is one of two mice and animals that we have at the V&A. Another is a billy goat, which you may know, which is up in our ceramics galleries. And here we have a king vulture made in about 1731, which actually sits in the Europe gallery, so not actually in the ceramics galleries. It's hard paste porcelain, life-size piece, painted in unfired colors. And of course, many of us here today know the story and the alchemy behind this European discovery of white gold, the arcanum, and the key figures involved in that, from Johann Friedrich Butger to von Schirnhaus. And of course, this leading discovery of the secret of porcelain leads to the finding of the Meissen porcelain factory in Dresden. And what I find really remarkable about this piece and the animals in general is that this is created just 20 years after we actually discover how to make hard paste porcelain or true porcelain in Europe. And essentially, the factory have to completely reinvent what they do know and their pace and the processes of working in order to respond to this very lavish, huge commission from Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony, King in Poland, who sort of suffers from what becomes known as a maladie de porcelain. So he's absolutely China mad, so much so that supposedly he once exchanged 151 Chinese vases for 600 soldiers. And of course, he decides that he wants a porcelain animal menagerie, what else, to kind of display in the upper floor of his Japanese palace in Dresden. So he commissions almost 600 life-sized animals from Meissen. In the end, 458 are made, of which this is one. And I just think in terms of materials, this is a huge technical achievement, a huge technical project that's undertaken by the factory. And it gives a real sense of craftsmanship of what was being able to be achieved at this point. So the archanists, the people in charge of the paste, actually had to develop a new porcelain body for these large sculptures. They were actually fired in one whole piece, but they were too big to sit in the saggers, traditionally in the kiln. So they had to be put into the kiln directly, and then a protective wall of sagger tiles was actually built around the animals. And they went through an initial biscuit firing of up to 900 degrees, then a second firing to help the glaze, for the glaze to go on to help the material soften. So you're talking about a real chemical kind of experimentation happening to achieve these life-size figures, sculptures being fired. And what you can see here is that it did work, but quite a lot of these animals have really serious firing cracks from the stress that was caused in the kiln. So they're quite visible firing cracks on the bottom of this piece, on the oak, and also on the back. If I could have the next slide, please. But what I love particularly about this piece, and what also drew me to it, is the color. So Augustus, he also wanted animals to be made in natural colors to make them as realistic as possible. But of course, with such a large piece, it was too risky to put it back into the kiln for a third time. So quite a few of these were painted in unfired pigments by the court lacquerer Christian Reinhau. And they would have been incredibly bright to begin with, but they have dissolved over time. And what we're left with here are the traces of these colors on these materials. So we have greens and reds, which you can just see hopefully here on the bark and also on the feathers. But there would have also been unpainted sections as well left in the white. But I think that all of these materials work together, and I think are just a real testimony to the collaborative nature of the factory during this period, and the incredibly labor-intensive processes involved as craftsmen and artisans come together. And of course, not forgetting the great modeler, Johann Joachim Kendler, who is responsible for creating these animals and sort of breathes life into these ceramic pieces of sculpture. So they're full of life, they're full of dynamism, they're full of movement and personality, almost human-like. For me, especially this vulture, you can just imagine him surveying his prey. But I guess my question, or what's really led me to choose this object when thinking about this panel, is how do we as museum curators try to convey that excitement, that alchemy, the processes of those materials coming together and craftsmen working together to produce something in the 1730s, which was incredibly difficult, would still be difficult today really. And how do we convey that to the public? So really looking forward to maybe discussing some of those things with you.
We will definitely come back to that question. And also, I think I do want to come back to this idea of a curator somehow unmoored from the collection during this time, because this is a very strange period. Dora, I'm going to move on to you. And let me say, I suppose one of the, I suppose when I think of the goldsmiths, I think of it as rather a particular case, and maybe that's something that you will say something about.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm showing you just the single slide with 3 images. I'm sorry that the most important things are probably truncated at the right-hand corner of the screen, but I hope you can appreciate the beauty of what we're seeing here. I think for me, being a curator is about thinking with things. And that's about materials and materiality. And it's about helping people understand the challenges of working with particular materials and how those challenges have been addressed and mastered over generations of makers. I think the thingness of things is something that's very difficult to get across in museum conditions, but it is one of the great challenges. So I wanted to show you just, first of all, on the left, a single slide of the gallery that you mentioned, Tom, in your introduction, the Waterslide Bequest Gallery in the British Museum, which I curated with Stanton Williams Architects in 2014. It's dedicated to a single collection of Renaissance and later masterpieces, many of them in precious metals. And I think you can see from this one detail here, a lot of objects which look as if they're crafted from gold. In fact, there's not much gold in this gallery. There's very little gold plate. There's a few gold jewels, a wonderful mass of gold jewels, but most of what you're looking at is silver, heavily gilded to look like gold, which tells you a lot about the hierarchy of precious metals and the hierarchy of materials and the aesthetic value given to gold in this period. Everybody wanted to have gold and be surrounded by it. But this thick layer of gilding over the silver is something that, and what that gives, the allure of the object, is something that we have great trouble of explaining, I think, in galleries. In fact, there are a lot of different metals here looking like gold. And one of the things, that's one of the obvious problems, how do you get that across, the craftsmanship involved in the making of these objects, the technical skills? the hand-eye coordination that you need to make them, and that understanding of hand-eye coordination to understand them and appreciate them as well. Second problem, a lot of these objects are actually made to be handled, even if only on occasion. They're display pieces, but they were occasionally used. And that's particularly true of objects which you're meant to drink from. If you look at that rising diagonal line on the left of drinking cups in the forms of animals, hollow cast with silver, again, heavily gilded, they're actually very beautifully designed for purpose. They're fit for function. They are hollow cast and the heads come off so that you can drink from the body or you can drink from the head. You can use the head, which fits beautifully into the hand as a stirrup cup. And the wonderful Johannes Lenker bull, which I hope which I hope you can see on the lower left side, is actually ergonomically designed, almost like the most beautiful modern thermos for pouring into the head of that animal so that you can drink from it. How do you convey that in a gallery where the objects are so precious and can't be handled and are hidden away in glass cases? I think the best you can do is to light them as well as possible, and that's a great skill of the architect that you're working with. And also group them as intelligently as you can so people can match like and get a sense of types and classifications. Use the most expensive non-reflective glass. And the rhomboid shape of these cases with these sharp angles at the corners are intended to get you as close as possible to the objects, so that with the combination of the glass and the lighting, you almost feel you could reach in and touch them. So that was the aim in planning that gallery. Plenty of challenges there for people looking and thinking about materials and materiality. I moved after 28 years at the British Museum as curator of Renaissance Europe, working across all the materials that were known in Renaissance Europe and worked by craftsmen, to the Goldsmiths Company. And there I'm working not only with historic collections in precious metals, but also I commissioned contemporary pieces with my team, which is immensely exciting. The object I wanted to show you on the lower right-hand side of the screen, and I hope you can see it, is a bread basket that we commissioned in 2015 from the maker Nan Nan Liu for our exhibition Made for the Table, which was a fantastic exhibition of modern dining pieces in silver. It's made out of exquisitely soldered individual layers of silver wire. And it's so perfectly balanced that when you put it on the table or remove a piece of bread from it, it finds its point of balance. It's inspired by flowing water and that sense of the flow of the metal that she's managed to get through soldering the hot metal is quite extraordinary. When I spoke to Nan Nan Liu about how she worked, it was very obvious that she works from exquisitely made paper models. So she layers paper to get the sense of how she wants to make that silver wire technique work. And when I said, do you still have the model for our piece, our commission? She said, yes, she did have it. And she was very generous and gave it to us. And I took a photograph here on my phone of her standing on the steps of Goldsmiths Hall, holding the paper model in her hands. And something about the way she's holding it, I think, suggests the skill and the knowledge inherent in her craftsmanship as a maker, which I think is very communicative to me. And the model is so beautifully made that you wonder actually which is the real object, the model in paper or the silver finished piece. Actually, the model in paper is particularly exquisite. It's a work of art in itself. It helps to explain a great deal more about the making of the silver and the challenges and the skill involved in making the silver piece than the silver piece on its own. And it's very useful to us in teaching future generations of makers, our apprentices at the Goldsmiths Centre, and in explaining and interpreting what it means to have this knowledge, this craftsmanship in your hands, this mastery. But these are objects, again, that are meant to be handled. We do quite a lot of handling sessions in teaching. As I said, we use our pieces. We're very much a working collection, very much concerned with understanding techniques and working with the Goldsmiths Centre, teaching the next generations. So I hope that gives some idea of what's rather special and different in the continuities that are represented in the Goldsmiths craft within the collection of the company. And I imagine we'll also, if I might say just one thing, I imagine we'll be talking about the role of the curator in the digital age at a time when all our experience is mediated through screens, Tom.
we certainly will be. I mean, I just thinking about your most expensive glass available to create vitrines. I mean, I remember going to the Wadston Bequest Gallery when it opened, and I suppose quite a few people had been in, and probably I've never been in a gallery where so many people had left their breath on the glass because they are so trying to get so close. I think I remember, perhaps you told me, but that you had to have guards on rotation to scrub the glass clean more often than usual.
Well, yes, I think people do get very close because, in fact, this glass is so magical that it's almost has the properties of rock crystal. It's very special what it does to the object, and people.
Well, I mean, when we're talking about materials in the museum, the materials that we use to display things on or behind are also materials that are worth us considering. Charlotte, we're going to move on to your images.
So good night, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I chose this image because it's a detail of an exhibition that I curated in 2016 at the Frick Collection called Porcelain, No Simple Matter. And it was in collaboration with Arlene Chequette, an American ceramist artist, actually. But she displayed a few of her pieces in the show, like this Asian vase that you actually see on profile. But more importantly, she displayed a collection of 18th century Meissen porcelain from the collection of Henry Arnold. And she taught me a lot as an artist of how to look, how to display this material. And that's why actually the title is quite interesting, because porcelain, no simple matter, the matter of the materiality of it, it's not simple actually, for many different ways, and it's following my life now. But it's interesting because we tried with that material or with other materials that fascinate so many people. It could be art stone, it could be silver, it could be gold. I think it starts with passion. And us as curator, as professional, we are used to hold this material. And I think I'm probably like many of you are very tactile. I like holding things. I need to feel them. The first things when you receive a piece that you have never seen, you hold, you need to feel, you put it upside down, and it's this personal relationship you have with the object. And I think a passion with object actually pass through that touch, which of course in museum you cannot, because the public cannot touch it. So with Arlene, we try in that display of object to put object differently, upside down, in dialogue, in a weird way, that put people a little bit puzzled, like what is this harlequin is doing? It's reflecting itself in a vase. What is new, what is old? A lot of pieces were actually back. We saw the back of the figure. The cup were upside down, so you can see the mark. As curator, historian, we're obsessed with mark. And I saw the public has never been as engaged with the material, because we show them things that they were unseen usually when objects like ceramic are put in cabinets. So we kind of broke that. And it was very interesting to see the reaction of the public, because they start looking in different way and wanted to actually know more. And there were no texts actually about Meissen. So it was more looking at. It's an exhibition. It was a try. I don't say it need to be for a display in a museum. You know, it's, I think for exhibition we can try things and see how the public react. But I actually really love the way public that usually was not engaged with ceramic, certainly not with Meissen, react to the show. It's also, I use a contemporary artist, a contemporary view, a contemporary eye, a contemporary sensibility to help me to communicate Meissen porcelain differently. And in this case, I saw it was very successful. I want to move to the second slide, which is very different, and bring us today to another project, another exhibition So, and because I think exhibition can help us to try things differently. It's an exhibition that unfortunately is ready to open to the public, but has not been able to open to the public. And it's, of course, when you are now, or I am at the head of the museum, the National Museum of Ceramics, I have more than 50,000 ceramics to deal with, and how to display them. And I think it's going to be how to show and tell the story of the history of ceramic through the age, through space too, and to be at the same time traditional in the way of museum devoted to one material, I think should be, and how they also probably need to be more engaging to a broader public, because otherwise you attract only the specialist of ceramic. So I am in the middle, not in the middle, I'm just started like a few months ago. I actually arrived just few weeks before France was completely confined. So I'm very lucky to live actually on site. So I'm surrounded by ceramic, because I can go, I see the manufactory is just like here and the museum is here. So I'm very lucky to have this proximity that I need. But is it just to show a dessert service on a table with, print on the back? This is an exhibition to give the atmosphere. We have the same, if you want, ideas with the period rooms here and there. The public love it. It's maybe not only the only way to communicate how this material were used and displayed, but it's a way. And I think it's interesting to discuss tonight the pro and cons of this kind of very traditional display. But also I am with my entire team of curators, specialized all of them in ceramic, in the way of hoping to renovate entirely this museum, and that it's a long project, but really we are thinking exactly of what you are all addressing. It's bringing a different audience, trying to convey the materiality of this object to an audience, our passion, be at the same time innovative, but I'm not completely sure if I want to have screen everywhere. Can we be actually more, should be looking at the past? I've seen some museum, like I will name it because I think it's important to name sometimes example or counterexample. The Musée des Arts Décoratifs was a museum for decorative arts, and they renovated it and they put so many more of their objects in storage. And the story of decorative art is not really told anymore, just to be a little bit more fashionable. And I think we should maybe go back. I think the V&A find some very, very good solution. I think it's important for us at SEV to also keep the history of this institution created by Alexandre Brognard to create models for the manufacturing. The history of ceramics should be told at one point, but how? And at the same time, yes, we need also to talk. We need to be addressing this kind of museum to a broader museum. And I have to say, I'm very pleased, because one of my greatest models is the Corning Museum of Glass, which I thought it's really a fantastic job. And I love this museum, because there is also this possibility of touching, of trying, of seeing some display, craftsman, glassmaker working. And so it's very complex. I should probably stop, and we should continue the conversation.
Let's get talking, and because it's a really nice link. One thing you said, which I just found fascinating, talking about your exhibition at the Frick, was this idea of almost having to create displays that sometimes you test out displays that make the object strange again. That it might have been strange in its time as well. And I thought that was a fascinating point. And also what you say about how far we might need to look back at historical methods of display, or that they might actually sometimes be models for the future. You've just said that the Corning is one of your models. I'm just very quickly, I want a sort of very quick answer from each of you, the other panelists. Which museums have been some of the top places for you where you felt you really engaged with a material in a way that you hadn't expected? Kit?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to return the compliment. And when I was at the V&A working on the ceramics galleries, I spent a week or so at Sèvres, and I worked with the former, I think, former head of the chemistry department, practicing making my own enamels and practicing gilding and tooling, and to have the collection right there as well as the manufactory was a really, really wonderfully immersive experience, and I'm really excited to hear how Charlotte plans to develop that too.
We'll come back for more there. Caroline, which museum have you learned most from?
Typical, because I'm all about the Sèvres, but I would agree. I mean, I take master's students quite regularly to Sèvres, and to see the processes of the factory and then actually look at the historical collections, I think is wonderful. And something that also I think comes through the Wedwood factory, and of course the V&A recently has acquired the Wedwood Museum, which is now a V&A collection of Wedwood. And actually, I think that's one of the things that it offers as well, in the sense that you can go and see these pieces being made and how the material works, and then also look at the collections that have been built up around that as well. So.
Dora, don't tell me that you've found the most engaging materiality at Sèvres.
No, I can't say I have. I'm a great fan of Corning. I think it's so exciting the way you're introduced to the industrial applications of glass and the manufacturing. I find that very, very exciting. I don't know whether you still walk into the entrance and walk over an enormous lens made of glass, and the difficulties of casting it just make you think so hard about the material that you're interested in. But I also love the new Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Florence for the way it introduces all the materials and all the different sorts of craftsmanship and skill used to craft the cathedral. And I found that introduction to the tools, the spaces, absolutely fantastic.
That museum is an extraordinary museum insofar as it takes the objects seriously, but also allows for the theatre of materials. And that's quite an unusual thing. Display of materials is not always dramatic. If we're classifying things, taxonomizing things, putting them in cases. And sometimes, and I think that's part of what we're talking about today, this notion that Charlotte used an expression that I've got 50,000 objects to deal with, almost like they are unruly objects, that we've got to find ways of controlling their energies. Kit, I know you've done some work, I think going back quite far to your PhD, you're thinking about how things, the history of display, and I'm sure everyone in the panel knows a lot about the history of display, but let's just zoom back a little and think, I mean, how far can we learn about the history of materials from the history of how museums have displayed them?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I have been thinking about that with regard to glass as well recently, and I suppose that the great age of the museum was the mid, I suppose, 19th century, mid to late 19th century, and that was a period, I think, of great interest in the Italian Renaissance, and that happened also to be a great period for Italian glassmaking. And so Venetian glass, I think, achieved a great prestige in 19th century museums, and was really promoted within the history of glass in quite an antiquarian way, as was typical of the time, but one that I think has lingered on, particularly with glass, possibly more with glass than any other material, that gives a somewhat distorted view of glass through time, by virtue of the way it's being considered in museums. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, I suppose I'm thinking of, perhaps, as so often when we look back to the past, we see only one version of it or a couple of versions of it. And I suppose I imagine early photographs of museums in a book like the late great Giles Waterfield's book on museums, the People's Galleries, these wonderful photos, but that sense of, okay, here's a case of a vitrine with all of the Neapolitan porcelains in it, or the Capodimonte work. Here's a case with this, here's a case with this. Photography does something there where it turns the history of the museum into something that sometimes feels like it's colored with dust. Let me pass the question slightly to Dora before Charlotte, because I'm really interested that you were working with a collection that had been the Waddesdon bequest, which I suppose had been displayed in certain ways at Waddesdon, correct? And so how far you were thinking about the historical display of these materials as opposed to what they might mean as a certain collection in a certain museum, the British Museum?
Well, we were thinking very, very much about the history of the Waddesdon bequest, which ended up in Baron Ferdinand Rothschild's smoking room at Waddesdon. The room was absolutely created in 1896 to display the objects that are now in the British Museum. And although we don't know exactly how they were displayed, we have wonderful photographs from 1897 of the way he arranged the vitrines and how the objects were there. And he presumably had a key in his pocket, went in and unlocked the vitrine for his guests, and then took objects out, and they were looked at through wreaths of cigar smoke. Not exactly something you can recreate in a public museum in the 20th century, but...
Well, I mean, Philip Morris used to sponsor exhibitions until the 1970s, but...
Yes, what we did do, though, was have very carefully considered discrete screens on the wall with videos taking you back to where the object in the new display was in Baron Ferdinand's smoking room. And it took you back to the 1897 photograph of the piece in situ and shows a smoking candle, so that you get a sense of the presence of the room. But I think one of the things that's very noticeable to me is how silver and precious metals have always been kept, obviously because of their value, in very secure treasuries. And that's about value and prestige, but it's also the fact these are assets that need to be melted down in order to go off and fight a war or whatever you may need to do. And I think that tells you a lot about their place in the hierarchy of materials in Europe in history. If you think that they've always been displayed that way, massed together as objects to do with status and significance.
Before I come to Charlotte, is there a residue of that history of keeping things safe, keeping them secure, in how certain types of materials are still displayed in museums today?
Well, it's certainly something you still have to think about very much
Well,
as a curator.
You don't want someone breaking into your Kunstkammer in the museum, but I guess what I meant is, do some of the more precious objects or objects considered on a market value or an insurance value is perhaps better to put it, more valuable, sometimes seem to accumulate different ways of being displayed?
I think there's a tendency sometimes to overlight silver so that it's all bouncing light off your eye, which is very distracting and actually stops you taking in the real subtleties of making and technique and mastery of the material, which is very, very difficult to deal with when you're lighting very highly reflective surfaces. It's one of the things you have to think about, why lighting is so important.
Charlotte, you wanted to come in on something that Kit was saying earlier.
Yeah, I think for me there is really, we all irritate of the 19th century way of displaying these materials, that for sure. And there is the museum with, as you mentioned, Tom, earlier, with all of the cabinets and by centers. And I think for me, these museums were made for amateur, for the collector who is building his own collection and need to compare and need to see, oh, in this museum at that, and which factory come from, and the mark, and so it's really for amateur collector museum for this 19th century that was all about collecting and rediscovering this material. And after you have this, I mentioned again the idea of period room, of showing how these objects were used, the functionality of these materials. And that's something we inheritate now, these two way of doing. And right now, I think for the last couple of years, it's not new, but it's an interest really on how they're made. And the other side, the other flip, it's not who consume them, who use this material, but the craftsman, the designer, the process of making this object. And that is a story that we are all, I think, in the world, in museum, fighting to how we can explain and convey that story. Because there is the story of the display, and there is the use, the function, you have a cup of tea, how it was with womb by womb, the social aspect of that. But there is also this really fascinating aspect that now some museums have found great solution, but I just don't think there is an ideal way of doing it. Maybe using actually too much videos and film inside the galleries. So that's why Corning is great, because you can see actually people making it. And I love that. And I'm really hoping that that serves what I can do, creating a bridge that is closer between the manufacturing and the museum. But there is also something that is getting here and is important today in our culture is cross connection, sometimes I want to say, I say that for me right now, too much ceramics kill ceramic. You need to see a material in relationship with a drawing that come from, with the sculpture. You need to show Boucher, Falconet, Boiseau to understand and appreciate also a livre, a book of models, or the tapestry that represent the same subject matter, or I think there is so many other ways that enrich the understanding of the materiality that is interesting to bring into that story, but not only in the process of it, it's also cross-cultural. And that is where the story becomes even more complex, is you have the same motif that was actually found in Italy or in Spain, and that is when the story actually gets very interesting, and I think the public can get very excited about that. It's because it's more universal than what we think, and we need to open this cabinet that was created in the 19th century, even if we should keep them for their matter, but bring also the stories of this material in a more engaging way.
Well, of course, at the V&A has the luxury of the collection and the space to be able to do things in multiple ways at once. I'm sure other museums do as well. But Caroline, I wonder if I can just come to you and think about how at the V&A, I suppose in the historical galleries or the European galleries and the British galleries, there are opportunities to contrast materials, but still, for me, there's something exciting, like I'm stepping back into a museum from 100 years ago when I go up to the top floor of the V&A and walk through that, I suppose, working collection, teaching collection. Is that, I mean, would you hold on to that presentation on the top floor of the V&A?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think in many ways, the V&A itself as a museum is so rooted in this categorization of materials, and the role that ceramics plays within that, embedded it simply even in the ceramic staircase, from the original kind of entrance and the gamble room and the cafe and things like this. And as you say, then you get up to the top and we have the dense storage with a huge number of ceramics on display and a study room, which really opens up doors in the sense of having handling sessions and teaching with those collections as well. In terms of how that links historically, I mean, I think as Kit maybe mentioned, there was a huge redisplay at the ceramics galleries about 10 years ago, which was done quite, with a lot of consideration. One of the key things that we have in that is a very long gallery, which is completely dedicated to materials and techniques, and is also the space where we have an artist in residence. So I think whilst in some ways these denser storage displays or the wooden cabinets that we still have do enable us to see these wonderful objects and have that popular connoisseurial approach of comparing and contrasting different pieces from the same time period or geographical location, we also have these fantastic galleries that open up questions about making and the fragility of working with ceramics, and actually getting to see artists in residence, what they're doing, what they're displaying, and how they interact as well. I think it's maybe something that we strive for. And then actually in terms of the European galleries or the British galleries, this historic emphasis, for me, what I always find with those, and I do agree with Charlotte, that idea of having that totality and that's almost sensory experience of seeing everything together. One of the great things about ceramics is the color never fades so often. And actually you do really get the sense of what it should have looked like in total when you see it against the tapestries or the textiles or the wood and the pattern of the furniture. So actually, I think...
Caroline, can I interrupt you just to say, because you mentioned the colors, and it just takes me back to the Meissen vulture that you opened with, and you asked a question which I sort of want to ask back to you. You spoke wonderfully about this object. That's one way to try to engage people, particularly when we can't see the object, is speaking about it. Sure. What else would you do with that object to try to communicate the excitement that you feel when you look at it?
A really good question. I think the craftsmanship or the making of it is perhaps something to really think about. And I think even with the mice and animals, you know, they can speak to so many levels, from kids and kind of educational purposes, and that idea of crafting your own animal or your pet or something, you know, to actually thinking more technically about that complexity of that process and the other animals. But I mean, with this particular one, we used it as an object of display for London Craft Week, and that was purely, it had to be a video, so it was me standing beside the object, you know, and no one could visit the galleries at that time, and that video was kind of sent out. So I'm still trying to figure out and navigate, how do we really tell those stories? For me, I think it's the color that's so important with that object as well. You know, it's really rare that it still has so much of its color. So maybe playing around with what it would have looked like initially, or trying to do 3D representations or reproductions that are of the full color. Who knows?
I would say one thing, which you know, you said it's an animal, and it sounds like such a simple thing to say, but it just shows us that you know, people are fascinated in different historical contexts, but in things that we might consider quite childlike, and they're fascinated with those things throughout history. We're publishing an article, a review of the Torlonia Marvels exhibition on our website tomorrow, and of course we're going to lead with the goat, the great goat sculpture, because it's the thing that is most engaging still, and I don't think that we should be too pretentious sometimes about why people find things engaging. It's the simplicity of the image and what it represents that then is a way into the more complicated materiality. Charlotte?
I think right now, we all need, or I need, but maybe to bring a broader audience. Okay, we want to touch an interest from children to old people who have never seen a piece of silver, try gold, how to do that. And I think it's complicated, because now also the public we have is in a many way, back to compare with 19th century, more educated, or at least he has more opportunity to know a broader world. And we need to address all of that: the technique, the display, the cross-reference, the comparison with other. And so it's an object is multiple stories. We know that. We take the animal from Meissen, I always say it's like a magic box. You like, you know, like you want to touch it, and it tells you 20,000 stories. And who collected it, how it was displayed at the Rothschild. It's all of these stories that we want. It's layers and layers and layers of stories, and how we can convey them to the public when it comes to a museum. Are we choosing only one? Is there only the videos to do it? Is it only people? That's the question that I think I would love to know more about.
Well, I'm going to go to Kit on that, and to the Corning as well, because Kit, I want to ask you specifically about the balance at the museum between the use of audiovisual material, the use of specific live displays by glassmakers at the museum, and handling, the extent to which the visitors can handle objects. I presume all three of those are elements in how you communicate the properties and possibilities of glass, but what do you think is the most successful, or what balance of those?
Well, I mean, the museum collection, the objects themselves we all recognize are the core, the foundation of the campus. But going to Charlotte's point about the international, the global stories attached with the materials that we work with, albeit in a European, broadly European context, is also something that we consider when a third of our visitorship is from East Asia, or was from East Asia, which has very different glass making traditions to the European ones. Having the blown glass demonstrations is, I think, for American, European visitors, hugely instructive, but also for people for whom it really isn't. There is not the studio glass movement in China, for example, only really began 20 years ago. So it really, I think, helps ground people in what the actual accomplishment of this material is, because glass is really almost defies its own materiality. And we have carts where people can handle blown glass and pressed glass and cut glass and so forth. So I mean, it's vital, I think, to understanding in a single material environment.
Do people come to the Corning just to watch the demonstrations?
I mean, local people certainly do. I mean, we are in a rural location, so many of our visitors are from the a 2-hour drive away, and they come repeatedly. So that's certainly a very family friendly activity. And we have guest artists, and we have the Blown Away Netflix series now, which is in its second run, which draws an enormous number of people. But we also have artists, professional artists, who come to use the facilities, and visitors can just go and watch them in our glassmaking school and give glass blowing a go themselves. So it's sort of incremental, and then go to the galleries and kind of get an eye for what it is.
Yeah, it strikes me that both Dora and Charlotte, in the images that they gave us at the beginning, included things that, in a sense, that they as curators had found that one gateway to understanding a particular material was through a practicing artist, and how far, we don't want to necessarily say we're going to instrumentalize artists all around the place and they have to be showing us and telling us about materials. But Dora, it seems to me that at Goldsmith, the Goldsmiths company, there's that opportunity to, I mean, it would be fetishizing artists to say that they always talk differently about materials than how other people talk about materials. But to some degree, it sounds like that is something that opens up for you when you talk to the makers at the Goldsmiths company.
I think our relationship with our makers at the Goldsmiths company is our very, very special, unique selling point. It's just extraordinary how we can draw upon them to show us what it means to work silver or to work gold. They show us chasing, engraving, all these different skills. And it does convey something very, very special. Partly, it's almost balletic, and the sounds involved, it's a meditation to watch somebody really deeply engrossed in working. Somebody like Rod Kelly drawing on silver, which is what chasing on silver actually is. It's the closest thing to drawing. It's a magical thing, and it certainly conveys something about the challenges of working material, which I think is very special. And of course, at the Goldsmith Centre, there are workshops, live workshops and demonstrations, apart from teaching, where you can really understand and get to understand processes in a completely new way. And they do wonderful workshops at the Goldsmith Centre and wonderful teaching materials for children and for teachers, which I really recommend if anybody wants to understand what it means to work precious metals or a particular technique.
We are going to have to, in a second, move into the breakout sessions, because otherwise I happily could continue having this conversation for another hour or even more. But what the breakout sessions are going to allow, for those who stay, I really hope that you will stay, is to talk further about the things you've heard. I know that the people behind the scenes are going to put some talking points into the chat box, and if we could have those going in there now. There's nothing right or wrong, obviously, to say in the breakout sessions, and in fact, the prompts for discussion that are going to appear in your boxes in a second very much are focused on some of the things we've touched on. There are questions about how far broadcasting, such as Kit's just talked about, might help us to understand materials. questions about which art critics managed to write about materials. I'm not going to ask to go into the breakout session until I've seen this stuff appear in the chat box, because otherwise we won't get the prompts in the chat boxes when they come. In the meantime, I've got a question though, which has come in while I'm waiting for that to appear, which is, the question is about materials masquerading as other materials, imitation materials. So let's ask this question quickly. And the question is the extent to which a material might display a museum in its raw state as much as in its cooked state, as it were, or in its worked state. I wonder, have any of you ever worked in museums where displaying the raw material has been a fundamental part of communicating what it has been worked into? Nobody. It seems like a very unusual. Charlotte.
No, it's not right now, but it's one of my first point for the renovation of the museum. I think we should show kaolin material, how all of the exactly what we are talking about, like, and even possibly the possibility of touching or feeling it. I think the transformation from raw material is very, very fascinating. And that is when you go through the manufacturer, because actually you can visit the manufacturer, but on special visits. You are all special visitors, so you can do it, but the regular public can do it in very small groups, let's say. It's not completely open. So, and when they see this raw material from that rock that's become powder, and after what could be done through the age since the 18th century up to today, I think it's where you start to really have people posing and just say, wow, what's the process and the possibilities of the material. And I think that is when it's exciting, and when we can see people coming again. And I see with Christopher, like, you know, our recurrent visitors being interested and fascinated by the material. So I think it's very, it's a good idea to start with the raw material.
I've seen it in exhibitions. I mean, I think I remember the wonderful exhibition on illuminated manuscripts at the Fitzwilliam Museum about 4 or 5 years ago, which had that focus on pigments and allowing us to remember that these things aren't fully formed in any way, and the elements that constitute them have had to take journeys and been worked and refined themselves before they've come to the hands of an artist or group of artists.